Is it this one or the next
one? The other one.
Yeah. So we have Lisa from the School of Literature. Was that right?
Literature, Languages and Cultures, that's my school, from the Department of English Literature, yes. So I'm also a book historian, but I come from an arts background, and I think that makes me quite unusual amongst the speakers, because we've had a lot of humanities perspectives from history and social science, so I'm coming at things from a slightly different angle, and I'm sorry to say I've got no religion at all in my paper. I'll try and throw some in if I can. Okay, so I'm interested primarily in printing and publishing. And I'm interested in them as creative practices that engage with other creative practices like writing, illustrating, and the book arts. So I'm really interested in aesthetic objects and aesthetic experience. I'm also interested in digital tools for analysing the kind of material that I work with. So I do things like markup editions of texts to put them online, make them accessible and searchable for other people. I also work with bibliographic data, visualising that to look at things like co-publication, and do visualizations of texts to look at collocations and word frequencies and things like that. So what I want to say today really comes out of my experience of working with digital tools, but also in archives as a historian, and also with artworks as aesthetic objects. It comes from the intersections of those different areas, and really about a conflict that I feel in the way that those different approaches ask me to think about my material, the stuff that I work with. On the one hand, archives demand that we think of material as documents. Digital tools ask us to think of material as data. Works ask us to think about material as things, as objects in themselves, artifacts. I'm going to come back to the idea of data and the digital at the end of this talk, because obviously I'm going to focus on documents today. So the document to me is something that points beyond itself, takes its meaning from something other. It's a representation that stands in differential relation to lived experience, registering events, agreements, processes, and documents appear as reflections or traces. We look through them. Now, in common sense terms, we often treat books as documents. One of the effects of print culture, according to the seminal work of Elizabeth Eisenstein, and if you're familiar with Bruno Latour's work, you might be familiar with Eisenstein's name because he bases a lot of his understanding of print culture on her work. Eisenstein argues that with the introduction of the printing press, texts are stabilized, and we're encouraged to, or have been encouraged to think about them as fixed, as immutable mobiles, in the phrase that we heard earlier. This is because it became possible to think about an authorized version, a standardized version, the version that the author intended. So over time, with the assertion of authorial rights and copyright, books came to be seen as documents of somebody else's ideas, thoughts, stories, something that existed as a text, as something else that wasn't the book itself. As if those thoughts, ideas, and stories existed prior to and outside of the material text, somewhere in the head of the author or something. As if the text stood in differential relation to the book, so we could look through the book to get the ideas. So very much like a document, same structure. My own research begins from a skepticism about this commonsensical idea. Because if there's one thing that book history shows us, it's that mobiles are not immutable at all. Paper falls apart, things become illegible, mistakes get written into documents. They are very mutable indeed. I also know from my own experience that my ideas don't really exist until I try to get them into that recalcitrant material that is language, until I say them or until I write them. I'm wrestling with the material of language, if that is sound waves and the physicality of muscular movements in line with my thought, or if that is ink on paper, the keyboard. So I would argue that just as speech doesn't exist without the physicality of sound waves, muscles, writing does not exist independently from its material supports, the page, the book, and the screen. And this means that we have to take very seriously those physical supports, those material supports. We have to take very seriously the aesthetic dimensions of things, of documents. So as a book historian, while I'm interested in the sociological dimensions of books, the ways that they circulate, the mechanics and politics of printing and publishing, distribution, reading, I'm also concerned with the materiality of what I'm looking at, its visual and tactile qualities, the ways that formal features, appearance and condition all guide interpretation and analysis. So let me show you how this works in relation to my own research. This is a page of a novel called Adelphia 1920. I was looking at it because I'm currently conducting a research project looking at small press printers and publishers in the early 20th century. And it was a novel written by and published by a man called John Rodker, who's one of the people that I have been looking at. What you can see here is, on the one hand, the standard text of the novel, just laid out, nice big margins. And on the other page, the image of a text. So this is the presentation of a funeral notice. It's Prince Kojo Tuvalu Huenu of Dahomey, now Benin, and it's announcing the death of the king of Dahomey. Rodker was a writer and printer, and he was very interested in the history of print, so it's not unusual for him to be playing around with the page, playing around with layout and the visual properties of the text. But what is surprising is the way that this appears in the novel. So this novel is, it's a stream of consciousness novel. I don't know if that means anything to people here, but it's basically a representation of a character's mind. It's meant to take us into his mind and let us experience his thoughts. It's otherwise completely standardly laid out and entirely an internal monologue. At no point before this funeral notice appears is anything to do with it mentioned. So we never hear these names before, we never hear them afterwards. It's got absolutely no bearing on the story. It just appears here from nowhere. And so the question is why? Why present it in this way, and why present it as the image of a document? Why present it as the image in the text? Believe it or not, critics have been reading this novel for years now, and I've not come across anybody who's even mentioned this image. So it's like people are just reading over it and ignoring it, which is very strange, I think, given the way that its materiality intervenes in the story. It's a facsimile of a real document, as I say, and I won't go into too much of the history about it, but the person that it names is real. And it's pointing in 1925 to a contemporary political debate in France about the role of Africans in French Africa in colonialism. So it's pointing to the idea that French Africans may have conspired with colonial forces, and to the anti-colonialist movement. The person here, Tovolo, is an anti-colonialist campaigner and a Pan-Africanist. So it's pointing to something very real, which the immediate audience, immediate readers of the book, would have recognised instantly. So without going into the political background, what I think he's trying to do here is to challenge the category of fiction and the category of document, to use the two of them to open one another up, to defamiliarise them, and to force us to reconsider, when we encounter them, our relationship to both of them. It's reminding us that objects don't have an intrinsic essence that makes them a document or makes them a literary work, makes them an artwork. That comes down to a choice, and it might be a subconscious choice, but it is nevertheless a choice, a decision we make. When we encounter things as if, I'm going to approach this as if it's a document, I'm going to approach this as if it's fiction. And these choices, which we make often without even thinking very much about it, have profound consequences for the way that we think about the material that we work with and the way that we analyse it. So this page points to the material life of writing, the way that an object can be an actor within history, intervene in history and change the process of interpretation, not simply a record of history. Reading books in both ways, as if they were documents and as if they are aesthetic objects, is really key to my work. I'll give you another example here. This is something I found in an archive on a recent trip to Texas, to the Harry Ransom Center. It is a report on the pumice stone industry of the Lipari Islands. Sounds fascinating, doesn't it? It was written in 1895 and it was republished in 1928. The Lipari Islands are just off Italy, and they were using child labour. And this report was an attempt to persuade the Italian office, Foreign Office, to change their working conditions. It's boring. It's so boring that the person who owned it didn't even open it. The pages are uncut. So they had this, and they kept it for their entire lifetime, actually. That person died 40 years later. They kept this document for 40 years. They didn't open it. Everything else that they had from the pre-Second World War period was destroyed in bombing. And this document survived. So it's a very, very odd document. I found it in Rodker's papers, the papers of the publisher I was just talking about. Rodker, as I say, lost almost all of his private papers in the Second World War. He was romantically linked with Nancy Cunard, this publisher, in the early 20s, and he, by 1928, had ceased to have contact with her, as far as we know. Their relationship's been largely forgotten. She was very famous. She was a civil rights campaigner and a socialite. He was a nobody, basically, a Polish-Jewish immigrant from the East End of London. So she's been remembered and he has not. What's interesting about her, though, is that how she came to open a press, how she came to print, is a mystery. Nobody really understands how that happened. This, I think, gives us the answer. Either Rodker was there, or she sent this to him in 1928. Either way, there's a connection at that time, and she's either showing off to him, or he is helping her learn to print. So he is where she learns printing from, I think it's fair to say. The report doesn't document relationships. It bears witness. It sort of holds affects and feelings and suggests them through its condition or location. And if you found this document and you tried to look through it to the content, you would simply miss that. What's important about it is where it was found and the condition it's in. Those things tell us a completely different story, an entirely different story. And I think actually here's where I have quite a different perspective on bias and objectivity to some of my colleagues in the social sciences and humanities. Critical perspectives and critical subjectivity is fine in literary studies. We're quite happy to work from that. So now in conclusion, I just want to go back to the unease about data and about documents that I mentioned at the outset. The term data comes from the sciences. It's not natural for a humanities scholar, but it's something that we're having to think about increasingly as we start to work with more digital material. And as data becomes more and more fashionable, Miguel mentioned earlier big data, and there's lots of talk in the humanities about big data. Like the idea of a document, it suggests a kind of neutrality. Documents present themselves as transparent, data presents itself as raw, there to be interpreted and therefore interpretation neutral. In digital literary studies, many scholars are excited by the prospect of treating texts like data, mining them in order to analyse greater bodies of material more effectively, more quickly, and some would argue more objectively. I'm also excited by this, and I recognise that we need to do this. But the particularities of historical context, the particularities that often inhere in the materiality of books and in the material organisation of archives get erased in digitisation and the idea of data. So this is something that we were mentioning earlier as well. For humanists who are interested in precisely historical, social and political contexts, this cannot but be problematic to a degree. So if document implies looking through material to something beyond it, data implies reduction and collapses distance between information and interpretation. Data is simply what is given. Neither provides me with a framework for looking at my material, my stuff, and understanding it in its complexity and its particularity. Most worryingly to me, the dominance of the term data, the way everything seems to be data these days, seems in danger of short-circuiting the as-if of the choice we make when we decide how to approach artifacts, things, stuff. Obscuring the fact that approaching something as data is as much of a choice as approaching it as a document, or as approaching it as a material object, as approaching it as an artwork. In other words, reducing things, texts, and books to data, and I'm thinking of Google Books here more than anything else, obscures the different choices that we might make as scholars, flattening out the potential of different modes of analysis by turning the operation into a simple information abstraction, process of extracting information, and ignoring the ways that the process of analysis, the process of interpretation, is creative, constructive, and generative.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Otty. We've got time for a couple of questions.
Do you think you kind of talk about the data analysis almost as the end point, but can you maybe not see it as a starting point, you know, a point to a scholar to start their work? I mean, obviously I have a bit of bias here because I'm a computer scientist, but that's kind of the way that I see it. It's not replacing the scholar at all.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And I think working with both is the way forward, you know, totally. It's more the rhetoric of data that worries me slightly in terms of things like...
That's the be-all and end-all.
Yeah. And the way that, you know, people are so... I don't know if you know much of the work of people like Franco Moretti, for example. So he works with big data in digital literary studies, and he basically says openly, I want to turn literary studies into science. I want to turn it into, you know, data is raw and I'm just extracting all this true stuff from it. It's rhetorically very powerful and very problematic.
Let's take on just a second before, so I'll let you go.
So very small comment. I use this in class quite a lot, and so it would be useful for all of us to remember data comes from Latin, which means attributed. So data is not something which is out there. But also the other thing, which is a bit more interesting possibly, is why you are taking Eisenart as benchmark and not the work, for instance, of Adrian Jones or others who have, in fact, explored the kind of things that you are looking at.
Oh,
in
no.
fact, when you said that Latour was inspired by Eisenart, I thought that Latour was much more coherent with Adrian Jones' work.
Eisenstein.
Eisenstein.
Yeah.
Is a big name in management studies.
Yes. I mean, I take her simply because she makes that argument about the fixity of print and the stability of print. So I take it as a step. Adrian Jones is exactly who the idea of the mutability of immutable moments comes from. It's Adrian Jones who makes that critique of Eisenstein's work early on. So that's, I'm channeling him there. Yeah.
Awesome. By my watch, I think you finished early, so we do have one more question. If you.
This comes directly from your presentation, because I've never thought about this before. But I wrote down a couple of things. You said that books are documents of somebody else's thoughts and ideas, and I like that idea. But you also talked about documents and books compared to data and digital. In the past, somebody's thoughts and ideas were made important by the fact they were worth publishing because it was quite a protracted process. Now we have things that are digital. Do you think that a lot of the stuff that's being published, although it's democratized much more our getting into it, it has diminished the value of those people's thoughts and ideas because so much can be published?
Well, it's certainly changed ideas about authority, and the relationship between authorship and authority is as you suggest, very interesting and historically interesting. I don't know if it's diminished it really. I mean, I think just more people can publish now. I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm very pleased. But I think it's, again, it comes back to this question of material. When I said that I think that books can be thought of as documents, I was trying to suggest that is a problematic way of thinking about books, because it positions them as transparent, as if the ideas are just they're just vessels. I think a speaker said earlier, as if they're darts, just a sort of meaningless communication from one person to another. But the materiality intervenes in interesting ways, and the material of publishing online, for example, intervenes in different ways. You read something differently, or you approach something differently online than you do if you find it in print. We still ascribe authority, as we all know, to the printed monograph that we don't to the blog post. So I think how you find something, where you find it, the form you find it in, is hugely important still in questions of authority. We have more complicated ways of recognizing authority, perhaps, but still very much there.
I think about that every time I read something.
Awesome.
Thank you.
It's exactly the sort of impact we want. Thank you. Dr. Llewellyn?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry.